이 다음 주제에 대해서는 미국 보스턴으로 저희들이 연결을 할까 합니다. 이 보스턴 터프트 대학 교수이시죠. 또 세계적인 베스트셀러의 작가이기도 합니다. 칩 워를 저자입니다. 크리스 밀러 교수님 강연을 들으실 건데요. 저희들이 시차 관계가 있어가지고 사전에 강연은 녹화 영상으로 준비를 했습니다. 하지만 강연이 끝나고 나면 미국 현지에 계신 밀러 교수님과 라이브로 연결을 할 것입니다. 그래서 제가 직접 여러분들이 궁금해하시는 내용들을 질문을 드리고 대답을 듣는 시간을 마련할 테니까 밀러 교수께서 여러분에게 드리는 강연 내용을 잘 한번 귀 기울여서 들어보시기 바라겠습니다. Professor Miller, all yours.
I'd like to congratulate the Yonhap News Agency on this first Future Economic Forum. It's an honor to have the opportunity to join this forum, and I'm delighted to see the Yonhap News Agency contributing to this important debate on semiconductor policy and the future of artificial intelligence. Well, to begin, congratulations on the first Future Economic Forum organized by Yonhapnews. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present here today on the implications of the US presidential election on the semiconductor industry and on the future of technology and artificial intelligence. If you look at the key drivers of advances in artificial intelligence over the past decades, what you find is that the primary force making artificial intelligence systems better over time has been advances in computing power provided by better and better semiconductors. This chart, for example, shows the amount of computational power used to train the machine learning system that was the most advanced of its era. And as you'll see, the amount of computing power used for training these AI systems has increased exponentially, with the rate of exponential growth increasing over the past 15 years as we've entered the deep learning era of artificial intelligence. In other words, all AI progress depends not just on better algorithms, but better semiconductors. And this is why today, across the world, all of the major economies and major governments are focused on semiconductors in a way they've never been before. It's also why when you look at competition between China and the United States, semiconductors are at the center, not only because they themselves are an extraordinarily valuable product, but also because they enable the technological advances that are believed in both countries to be likely drivers of future technological capability, economic prosperity, and also military power. Because of this, today, many of the world's leading governments are not simply targeting the semiconductor industry as an area of priority. They're focusing on growing their computing power. China, for example, has targeted a 50% growth rate in the amount of computing power in the country as it tries to compete with big US tech firms like Meta, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon. And China is not alone. Many countries today are targeting growth in computing power as a metric of their success in preparing themselves for an age of artificial intelligence, which raises the question, who is going to win this race and how will the presidential election in the United States and the victory of Donald Trump affect the US policy towards this critical sector? When you begin to examine the computing infrastructure in the world today, there really are only two key players that matter. This chart shows you the numbers of servers installed in different countries, a rough proxy for the amount of computational power that different countries have. And as you'll see today, the United States is far in the lead. China is far in position number 2, and the rest of the world is much, much smaller, smaller even than you'd expect given their relative GDPs. And that suggests that to understand the future race to build bigger and more capable computers, to deploy the computing power necessary for training AI, it would be a race between China and the United States to harness this capability. And this is a race that is going to be impacted by technology firms, by shifts in technology trends, by the impact of markets on these vast construction of bigger data centers, but also politics will play a critical role. And the fact that the US will have a new president as of January 2025 will certainly impact how this political struggle is impacting the technological and economic spheres. So what do we know about Donald Trump's plans in the semiconductor and technology sector when he returns to the White House in January 2021? The first thing that we can say is that Donald Trump has been a long-term proponent of imposing tariffs, in particular on countries that are running large trade surpluses with the United States, or that he believes have been using economic policy tools to compete unfairly with the United States. We learned this, for example, in his first term as president, when he famously tweeted that he is a tariff man. And indeed, this is a belief that he has espoused now for many decades, going back at least to the 1980s, when even 40 years ago, he was focused on tariffs as what he believed as the optimal economic policy tool. In his first term as president, Trump imposed tariffs in particular on China, but not only, either levying or threatening to levy tariffs on other major economies as well. And the tariffs that he put in place on China have generally been kept in place by the Biden administration, which indeed has actually increased the tariff rates on certain products imported from China to the United States. Now it seems Trump is likely to accelerate this tariff imposition when he returns to the White House in 2025. It's recently been announced in the media, for example, that he's appointing as his trade representative Robert Lighthizer, the exact same person who led the increase in tariffs in his first term. And it's, I think, inevitable that the electronics industry will be impacted by tariff increases because electronics are one of the most widely traded goods, and semiconductors are a key facet of this industry. Now, if you look at Trump's focus in his campaign on tariffs, he's focused primarily on China, which I think will bear the brunt of the tariff threats that Trump plans to levy. But he's also talked about imposing tariffs on other countries as well. And I think many countries, including major semiconductor producers, will begin negotiations to discuss ways to address the economic disagreements and to avoid or at least minimize the imposition of tariffs. And for semiconductor companies, this will be a critical issue to track. Today, semiconductor supply chains stretch across both sides of the Pacific. A typical chip is often manufactured in one country, packaged in a second, and assembled in a final good in a third country. And that means that tariffs can have a very significant impact both on the structure of supply chains and also on the viability of businesses' operations in specific countries. And so following the rate of tariff imposition and the types of products that are in fact tariffed will be very important for understanding the implications for the semiconductor industry. For such a globally interconnected industry, I think tariffs are likely to bring higher costs as they force supply chain restructuring and as companies adapt to try to take into account the ways that higher tariffs are impacting their cost structure in different countries. And so whether it's Japanese companies, Korean companies, Taiwanese companies, Chinese companies, American companies, they'll all be watching very closely the tariff schedules that are released, the tariff increases that are announced, and thinking through the implications for their business. After Trump began imposing tariffs in his first term, we saw significant shifts in supply chains. For example, assembly of certain types of products moved from places like China, which faced higher tariffs, to Mexico, which faced relatively lower tariffs. And I think we should assume, again, that if tariff rates increase, this will encourage companies to shift their supply chains to lower tariff destinations, which is, of course, the aspiration of the Trump administration when they begin imposing tariffs like this. So trade policy will be one of the first areas of focus of the new administration. And I think it will be quite significant for companies that are involved in international trade, as indeed every company in the semiconductor industry is. The second key policy area where I think we will see action from the Trump administration is to intensify the export control regime that currently exists that limits the sales of artificial intelligence chips, as well as chip making tools to China. Now, of course, these restrictions have been in place for some time. They actually began, at least when you look at the chip making tools, under the first Trump administration, which was already lobbying key allies like the Netherlands to limit the transfer of chip making tools like extreme ultraviolet lithography systems to China. These controls took an important step upwards in intensity under the Biden administration, which, in addition to imposing further restrictions on chip making tools, also imposed sweeping bans on the sale of high-end AI chips to China, most notably the NVIDIA GPUs like ones pictured here, which are critical for training artificial intelligence systems. Now, under the Biden administration, there's been some criticism from Republicans in Congress about loopholes in enforcement of these restrictions. And I think it's quite possible that as the Republicans take back power, they intensify both their enforcement efforts and also their closing of loopholes to make it more difficult to transfer AI chips to China and more difficult to transfer high-end chip-making tools to China as well. And as the Trump administration begins to think about the export control posture that it wants, I think it will also be thinking about potential Chinese retaliation. We've seen, for example, as the Biden administration has ratcheted up export controls on semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, China has retaliated, or at least threatened retaliation, by imposing new export control regimes of its own, targeting key minerals and materials like gallium and germanium. And I think it's highly likely that if the U.S. Further increases restrictions on the transfer of tools to China, China will retaliate by further intensifying its threats to limit critical minerals access of Western companies in China. In addition, China has directly targeted U.S. firms or threatened to target U.S. firms in the chip industry. Chinese regulators have now refused to allow a series of merger and acquisition transactions in the semiconductor industry, ostensibly on antitrust grounds, but in reality, as part of an effort to punish U.S. and Western firms over the U.S.'s semiconductor policy. In addition, we've seen, for example, last year, Micron, the U.S. chip maker and manufacturer of memory chips, faced investigations in China, which were very clearly a retaliation against U.S. pressure against China's chip industry. And so I think following the likelihood and the path of Chinese retaliation will be also important in understanding the speed and the scope at which the Trump administration chooses to expand the export control regime and try to slow China's chip-making progress. A third area of focus will, I think, be an intensification of efforts to encourage manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. This is something that began under the first Trump administration, which encouraged Taiwan's TSMC, for example, to begin construction on a new plant in Arizona. It was intensified under the Biden administration, which has been implementing the CHIPS Act, providing subsidies for both U.S. and foreign companies to build chip plants in the United States. And I think we should expect the Trump administration to pursue more announcements of investments in chip-making facilities. Trump has already suggested publicly that he might threaten tariffs on countries that don't announce new investments in U.S. facilities, pointing in particular towards Taiwan. I think less likely, tariffs are actually less likely in this case, but the threat of tariffs alone will, I think, begin to shape how companies respond to these types of requests to intensify their investments in the United States. And indeed, the recent news that TSMC's yield in its Arizona facility has now matched the yield in its Taiwan facilities provides, I think, encouragement to those in the United States who would like to encourage and to subsidize and to pressure other foreign firms to invest more in the United States. We've already begun to see, I think, preemptively, some non-U.S. chip firms try to align themselves more closely with what they expect the future US policy to be. For example, it's been reported that TSMC is going to begin more intensively imposing export controls on Chinese customers, going perhaps even beyond what's required by US law, partly, I think, as a response to the presidential election results and as a part of a desire to have policies that are more aligned with the incoming administration. And I think many foreign companies with operations in the United States will have to think carefully about how to align their policies with the likely policies of the new president and to establish relations with the new president's team. In addition to these foreign-focused aspects of the Trump administration's likely semiconductor policies, the tariffs, the export controls, the efforts to encourage foreign direct investment, there will also, I think, be a very significant domestic focus on increasing the ease with which one can build data centers and thereby encouraging future semiconductor demand. It's no secret that today the primary growth driver in the chip industry is data center demand, the provision of GPUs and high bandwidth memory that are needed to train and deploy artificially large data centers. And if you talk to data center builders or big tech companies in the United States, what you'll hear is that one of the biggest limitations to data center construction, and therefore one of the biggest limitations to building out of AI infrastructure and the purchasing of AI chips, is actually the provision of enough electricity to power the data centers that are required today and that will be required in the future. This chart from McKinsey shows the likely increase of electricity demand from data centers alone in the United States. They projected an almost 4 times increase between 2023 and the end of the decade. And the challenge to provide the electricity that data centers require is already creating both a surge of investment, but also real concern that electricity could be a limiting factor to the US data center build out, to the US AI development effort, and therefore also to the chip industry. Because if data centers can't be powered, then the rate of purchase of future chips will slow. We've already heard, for example, from the Trump administration, promises to streamline energy regulation, to make it easier, for example, to build new power plants, focusing in particular on nuclear power plants, as well as to facilitate the interconnection between grids and data centers that's required to build data centers. And so I think we should watch very carefully US energy policy, because energy policy is today a critical input to data center policy, and therefore an important determinant of the future health of the chip industry. And I think it's clear that the Trump administration is going to focus on this issue and see it as an important part of their deregulation agenda. In addition, it's now quite clear that Elon Musk will play some sort of role in the Trump administration, although the details are not yet clear. What is clear, I think, is that there will be a number of very influential voices from the technology sector advising the Trump administration, and I think encouraging a focus on artificial intelligence and on the infrastructure that's needed for the AI build-out. And this will mean that AI will be front and center, I think, of many of the administration's likely policy initiatives. This is, of course, not a change. The Biden administration have been talking about AI too, and you can trace back over many years focus on this issue. That's why, for example, the US is controlling the transfer of AI chips to China. It's why the US is so concerned about the resilience of its semiconductor supply chain. And so I think it's significant that the next administration, like the current administration, will have powerful and influential voices that are advocating for the construction of the type of infrastructure that AI will require. What does this mean for the world? It means that the globalized semiconductor supply chain that is already under stress after nearly a decade of intensified US-China competition is going to become even more bifurcated. I think anyone talking about a complete decoupling of the Chinese and US economies is misunderstanding the magnitude of changes. But nevertheless, we should expect ongoing bifurcation, with companies focusing on a Chinese semiconductor supply chain and a separate Western semiconductor supply chain. To some degree, this has already been underway over the past decade, but I think the combination of intensified tariffs and heightened export controls will encourage it further. And China's retaliation, which I think we should expect to these types of measures, will also encourage it. Indeed, China is only likely to double down on its drive to domesticate all of the semiconductor production that it needs as it responds to the policies that Trump is likely to impose, which means that we'll have both of the world's largest economies pushing for a more bifurcated economy, which will inevitably impose costs for companies as well as countries that have become accustomed to a unified global supply chain. But it also imposes opportunities, at least for certain countries and companies. If tariffs go up in one region, others become more competitive, for example. And companies in particular will be trying to think very carefully about how to optimize their strategy as tariff rates change, perhaps more rapidly than they ever have before. And all of this, I think, will take place amid the backdrop of further investment in bigger and bigger artificial intelligence models. And as the White House under Trump promises more electricity access and deregulation, I think this will only spur further efforts to raise billions of dollars and deploy them into AI training and AI deployment. And so the AI race will be, if anything, intensified by the presidential election result, which means that the chip war will be intensified too, because ultimately the chip war is a race to produce the chips that make AI possible and to prevent those chips from benefiting your competitor. And under the next Trump administration, I think we should expect an even more fierce competition to produce and control the chips that make AI possible and to build the AI models that the future of technology will depend on. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you, and I look forward to the discussion.
박수 한번 주십시오. 네. 지금 뉴욕 시간은 새벽 1시 20분 정도 됐습니다. 그래서 지금 연결이 됐군요. 프로페서 밀러, 질문이 많습니다. 교수님한테. 예상하셨겠지만 제가 추려서 지금 주무셔야 될 시간이니까 두 가지만 핵심적인 질문을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 한국말로 제가 읽어드리고 영어로 질문을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문입니다. 미중 갈등이 방금 말씀 주신 가운데 심화되는 가운데서 반도체 산업이 직접적으로 받는 영향이 점점 커지고 가고 있습니다. 이 기업 간의 기술력 경쟁을 넘어서 국가 대항전으로 진행되는 모습이고요. 이런 흐름 속에서 한국의 삼성전자나 SK하이닉스가 살아남기 위한 전략은 무엇이라고 생각합니까? The first question, here it is. The semiconductor industry is now overwhelmingly and directly affected by the growing conflict between the United States and China. It is not just a competition between companies, but also a battle between countries. What do you think is the strategy for South Korean companies such as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix to survive in such a mega competitive situation?
Thank you for the question. I think South Korean companies face a similar situation in many ways as companies from other countries, whether it's Taiwan or Japan, that are being squeezed in some ways by the China-US competition. And I think for companies in this position, they face several options for their strategies going forward. I think first, as tariff rates change, companies will naturally want to shift where they're producing and assembling goods, where they're possible to shift them to take advantage of the most optimal tariff rates. And this is something we've seen companies do extensively the past several years. I think second, companies are going to try to ensure they have as much access as possible to both the US and the Chinese market. And often companies are deciding that further bifurcation of their supply chains is part of that optimal strategy to provide a China-specific product to the Chinese market and a Western product to Western markets. And I think that dynamic will become even more pronounced going forward. I think third, companies have to think very carefully about their manufacturing base, and this is especially true in semiconductors, where there are now extensive restrictions on the types of manufacturing tools that can be used in China. And when it comes to future investments in manufacturing operations, I think we've seen across the chip industry a much less pronounced desire to invest new dollars in manufacturing facilities in China. And I think that skepticism about large-scale investments in China will likely continue going forward, both driven by uncertainty about Chinese policy and by restrictions. I think the fourth point, which is most important, is that companies, to ensure they've got technological differentiation in whatever market they're competing in. And this is particularly important, not only because the chip industry is always competitive, but because in China, there is a surge of government support for exactly the type of memory chips that Korean companies specialize in. And so unless memory companies can retain their technological advantage, they'll be quickly commoditized by newer Chinese competitors. And I think that's the most important challenge for both Samsung and SK hynix going forward.
예, 지금 밀러 교수가 말씀하신 게 축약하면 TSMC 같아요. Tariff, Supply Chain, Manufacturing, Comparative Advantage, 그런 것 같습니다. 자, 그러면 두 번째 질문 바로 이어서 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 반도체 산업에서 미국과 중국의 기술 경쟁이 미치는 영향에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다. 이들 국가의 영향력이 앞으로 어떻게 변화를 가져올지 어떻게 보시는지 궁금합니다. Okay, this is second one. What are your thoughts on the impact of technology competition between the United States and China in semiconductor industry, and how do you see their influence changing in the future?
Well, I think thus far the technology competition between the US and China has thankfully not really impacted the rate of technological change in the industry. Often you find that when security mandates get imposed in different spheres of the economy, the rate of progress risks slowing because there are restrictions on the types of investment or transactions that can be undertaken. I think in the semiconductor industry, because almost all of the cutting edge capabilities are today outside of China, in Taiwan, in Japan, in Korea, in the Netherlands, in the United States, the restrictions on their transfer into China hasn't made a major impact because the industry's most advanced capabilities were not in China in the first place. I think what we also have seen is a surge of investment in R&D, both by companies trying to stay ahead, but also by countries trying to ensure that their chip-making ecosystems and chip design ecosystems are as advanced as possible. And I think as there's been a renewed emphasis on building chips for AI over the past couple of years, that dynamic has only intensified. And so I would expect both China and the United States to continue focusing on AI semiconductors as a primary area of innovation. And I think both the private sectors in both countries, as well as governments, are going to continue supporting this type of innovation with substantial R&D investments.
Yes, Professor Miller, thank you very much. 오늘 시간 내주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 그리고 앞으로 대한민국의 첨단 산업에도 더욱더 관심을 가져주시고 계속해서 많은 조언 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다. 네, 마지막에 주신 말씀은 국가가 상당한 투자를 해야 된다는 점, 그리고 미래에는 AI 반도체 산업에 좀 더 포커싱이 된 그런 제조업과 조립 공정이 필요하다는 말씀인 것 같습니다. 이 내용은 세션 2에서 본격적으로 저희들이 삼성과 TSMC를 비교해 보면서 양 기업이, 기술 기업이 어떻게 앞으로 미래의 협력과 경쟁 관계를 가져갈지 그 역사와 전통 그리고 미래적 관점에서 한번 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 잠시 휴식 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 한 10분 정도 브레이크 타임을 갖고요. 로비에 커피하고 다가가 준비되어 있는 거 다 보셨을 겁니다. 화장실은 왼쪽에 있고요. 잠시 쉬시면서 커피 한 잔의 여유를 가지신 다음에 뒷자리에 계신 내빈들께서 진행요원의 안내에 따라 비어있는 앞쪽 테이블로 자리 이동해 주시면 어떨까 하는 생각입니다. 한번 앞으로 이동해 주시고요. 두 번째 세션에서 뵙도록 하겠습니다. 끝까지 미래경제포럼 참여해 주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다.